and see if that works. Okay, well, good evening, everybody. It's very strange to be doing a talk from your spare bedroom when you can't see anybody. Malcolm suggested that as we'd sent this out to the European Butterflies Group, I'd just say a couple of quick words about the European Butterflies Group and who they are. It's effectively a branch of butterfly conservation for those who are interested in European species as well as UK species. It's got about 450 members and it's still growing. Its main activities is that it promotes and funds research and conservation in Europe. And one of the ways it funds research is by bursaries, particularly for young people, especially students. Bursaries usually about £500 towards the cost of research. The key features of the EBG are that it has a very detailed website. I think if you Google European Butterflies Group, it should come up. Very much an information-packed website. Lots of information, including identification guides on Trillaries and the like, all produced by Bill Raymond. The EBG publishes a very comprehensive illustrated newsletter 2 or 3 times a year. And there's an AGM, which is particularly useful because you can get together with people and pick their brains to find out what species are being seen where. It's fairly easy for BC members to join. It's an extra £10 on the BC subscription. Okay, that's enough about the EBG. This talk will be basically a meander through France, looking at French species that are closely related to familiar British species. France has 237 mainland species. In Britain, we have 57. We'd like to have more, but Monsieur Macron's put a block on that because he says we've got enough already. Basically, all of the UK, not everybody's on mute, all of the UK species are occur in France. Britain doesn't have any endemic species. The species that we're going to look at illustrate that they all evolved from the same predecessors, the science of which is called cladistics, which is the study of common ancestors. When I look back at my ancestors, they're certainly all common. It's not an exact science, and it's one of the reasons why whenever the taxonomists get together, they still disagree and they continually change the classifications, even though they say this is the final classification. If you add into that mix the fact that many species have branched into subspecies, which have adapted to widely different terrains and their ecologies are very different, even though they remain genetically the same species. Basically, the more you look into the situation with European species, it turns up that there are more questions than answers. 1 or 2 questions. One that's always puzzled me is that if you take Ottoman and brassy ringlet, which I'm sure most people won't be familiar with, that's a species that occurs on or around Mont-Lozère in south-central France and in the Balkans. But for the life of me, I can't understand how were those 2 domains ever connected. If they weren't, how did it arrive on Mont-Lozère and nowhere in between? Some other species puzzle me, such as common species like peacock, brimstone, white admiral. They fly right across France and they're very common, but they don't occur in the far southeast of France, in Provence, which is really quite strange because they're very common everywhere else throughout France. There's also several species that occur in the Alps at high altitude and in Fennoscandia at low altitude, but again, nowhere in between. And I'm always puzzled to find out that long-tailed blue occurs pretty much unchanged around the world, and makes you wonder if that long-tailed blue has occurred since the breakup of Pangaea some 200 million years ago. But I'm sure there's people in the audience who know more about that than I do. Anyway, enough talk, let's see some butterflies. We start with two common butterflies, green hairstreak and small copper, which you're very familiar with. But if you if you cross a green hairstreak with a small copper, what do you get? Provence hairstreak? Well, actually not. Even though it looks like it's a cross between the two, it's completely unrelated to either. Provence hairstreak is a butterfly of Iberia, with its distribution spilling into the far south of France, where it's actually quite rare and localized. But the green hairstreak does have a relative, very close relative. It's called the Chapman's green hairstreak, and it looks almost identical. That also is an Iberian species which just spills into the far south of France and is as rare and localized as the Provence hairstreak. It's really surprising that the Chapman's green hairstreak, which was only discovered in 1909, which is relatively recent, but then its similarity to green hairstreak probably made it very difficult to realize that it was actually a separate species. But the Chapman's green hairstreak occurs in southern France, and it's surprising that it's not actually common because its food plant is strawberry tree, and much of Provence is actually carpeted in strawberry tree, but the butterfly itself is still extremely rare and localized. There are one or two ways to tell the difference between green hairstreak and Chapman's green hairstreak. One is that Chapman's green hairstreak has a rather more reddish feel to it, especially around this area here, around the eyes. It's definitely more reddish. But the one defining difference, given that all of the other things are variable, that I've never actually seen in the books, is that the inside of the antennal club for Chapman's green hairstreak is orange for the whole length. And for a green hairstreak, it's only orange at the tip. But I don't think I've ever seen that in books, but it does seem to be definitive. This is a rather unusual picture. I'm not sure how clear it is to you, but this is both green hairstreak and a Chapman's green hairstreak, face to face, nectaring on white asphodel. That wasn't a stage photo. That's actually how they were when I actually saw them. But that shows the difference, if you can see it, between the two antennae. This is Silverwash Trillary, which everybody's familiar with, male on the left, and you can see the very thick sex brands on those veins. Female on the right, and the bronze form Valesina on the far right. And below that, we have the sort of close cousin of the Silverwash Trillary from the far south of France. It's called Cardinal. It's not called Cardinal Trillary for some reason. They left Trillary off the name. But the males are very similar to Silverwash Trillary, but the thickened sex brands are not present on Pandora. I've called it Pandora there. It's actually, the English name is Cardinal. But it has this rather bronzish suffusion, and that's particularly strong on the female, especially in this basal region. I think it's a particularly beautiful Trillary. And you can see that it's related to the Silverwash Trillary from the underside. The male has a completely green underside, and this is a female, and it has the sort of slight silver washing, very similar to the Silverwash Trillary. I haven't given this talk before, so I'm having to refer to notes to remember what to say. Here are two species which are relatively, well, I say relatively common. Brimstone, common in the UK. And below that, we have Cleopatra. It's a very close relative, which occurs in the south of France, pretty much south of a line across Lyon. It's very similar to the Brimstone, especially if you see it in photos. I've managed to get a photo here where part of the forewing is actually exposed. So you can see that the forewing actually has these bright orange patches. This is quite obvious when it's flying, and you can't mistake it in flight, but it's rather harder to tell when it's settled because Cleopatra, like Brimstone, only settles with closed wings. Sometimes it's quite hard to tell the difference between the two, especially the females, which don't have this yellow or orange colouring, but the The brimstone has at the apex has a rather more pointed apex and a rather greater curvature at this point compared to the Cleopatra, but this is quite variable. On the right, we have wood white, not a species that we get in Herts and Middlesex. I'm not going to go into the other species such as cryptic wood white or reals, but just compare the two, wood white and eastern wood white. Eastern wood white is another of these puzzling species because it occurs in the south of France, is quite localized, but is basically a species of the Balkans. And it's unmistakable in the first brood because the first brood has this very strong, very marked hindwing pattern. Right, some blues, silver-studded blue top left, which I think we're probably all fairly familiar with. It's actually very common across France and right across Europe. Sometimes you get it at altitude and sometimes in huge numbers. It can be extremely common. Its closest relative is the Estrus Blue below, which is very similar. The principal way of telling the difference is that the black border of the silver-studded blue is much wider than the Estrus Blue, and the marginal markings around the hind wing are usually rather different. This is slightly unusual in that it has triangular marks, but the hind wing markings are quite variable. On the right, we have top right, Revedin's blue, which is a particularly beautiful blue, very bright, very strong blue colour. But that's not a butterfly of high altitudes, unlike silver-studded and Estrus Blue. It's a butterfly of Central Europe. It spills into eastern France and is generally a lowland species. And bottom right, another one from the same family, the Cranberry Blue, which is another high altitude blue, tends to occur in the northern French Alps in Savoie, rather more than the southern French Alps. But it's another one of the species that occurs in the Alps and in Fennoscandia, where it's often a low altitude species, but again, nowhere in between. But they're the upper sides, and here are the undersides, the familiar underside of the silver-studded blue and Estrus Blue. A good way of telling the difference between the two, when they've got wings closed, is that these sort of little chevrons here of Estrus Blue are quite sagittate or arrow-shaped, where to a much greater extent than for silver-studded blue. On the right, we've got the underside of the Revedin's blue, this beautiful sort of pale silvery blue colour, and it's unmistakable because it doesn't have any close cousins at where it flies, but the orange, the way to define it is that the orange band extends right across the margins of both wings, right to the costa of the forewing. Bottom right, we have the underside of the Cranberry Blue, which I think is probably one of the most appealing undersides of any blue. Beautiful bold markings, and this beautiful marginal lunule here, which is sort of black, red, and then sort of silvery blue. Speckled wood on the left. We're all familiar with speckled wood, very common in Britain, and below is the speckled wood, the nominate form. What we actually get in Britain and in northern France is the subspecies Titanius, which has this much paler yellow colouring, but the nominate form of speckled wood, which occurs from pretty much the southern France line across Lyon, has these much larger, much more yellowy orange markings. So whereas we think the speckled wood is our species and that the version in France is the subspecies, it's actually the other way around. Small tortoiseshell and large tortoiseshell, very similar. Really no problem in telling the difference between the two. Small tortoiseshell obviously very common in Britain. Large tortoiseshell are a very rare migrant to Britain. I think it's actually been seen in the Herts and Middlesex region as well in recent times. but it may make a return. Indications that its visits to the UK have become a little bit more frequent after it became extinct in, I think, around 1970. Curiously enough, although they look very similar, they're not of the same family, and in fact, the only relative in the same family of large tortoiseshell is a Camberwell beauty, which looks completely different. The species that we have in Britain is of the Erebia family of ringlets, is the Scotch Argus, top left. We have one ringlet in southern Britain, which is called the ringlet, but it's not of the Erebia family. It's of the family Aphantopus, of which it's the only member. Scotch Argus occurs in northern Britain and Scotland, and we have two members of this Erebia family in Britain, the other one being mountain ringlet. There's also the so-called Arran Brown, but even though it has been named after a Scottish island, it's relatively common altitude across the Alps, but I don't believe there's any indication that it was ever found in Britain, ever, despite the name. But France has about 30 of these Erebia ringlets, and this is just a page to illustrate the variation between them. Top middle is the common brassy ringlet, which has got this clear, rather brassy sheen, which is quite reflective when you see it in flight. I think common brassy ringlet's now called the Western brassy ringlet, but that's the taxonomist changing the game again. Top right, we have the Gavarni ringlet from the Pyrenees, as the name implies, Gavarni being a town in the far south of the French Pyrenees. Bottom left, we have lesser mountain ringlet with these, if it has any ocelli, these very small pinprick ocelli. Bottom middle is Menestra's ringlet, which is an Erebia from the further north of the Alps in Savoie and Haute-Savoie. And bottom right is the very attractive De Prunner's ringlet, which occurs in the far south of France and in Iberia. Again, comparing a familiar British species with its southern France counterpart, this is orange tip, male top left, female in the middle, and underside on the right. But I do believe this is where southern France has the advantage over us, because it has the very beautiful Provence orange tip. It's relatively common in southern France, probably not as common as you think, but it's quite unmistakable in flight, so you tend to notice it wherever it's flying, and it does fly in company with the orange tip. But it has this, whereas the orange tip is white, it has this beautiful pale sort of pastel yellow colour, and the female is doesn't miss out on this sort of colouring as well, as you can see from the apical markings. And the underside is quite appealing as well, with the white replaced by yellow. Top left and below, wool brown male and female. A UK species, sadly no longer in Herts and Middlesex, and under serious threat throughout the rest of the UK. But it has two very similar species in Europe. The so-called large wool, which is not much larger, it's only slightly larger, rather darker male with much less markings, and below is a female. There is a subspecies in southern France called a Drasta, which is rather more orange, and this is a female of that subspecies. I think it's an absolutely strikingly beautiful butterfly. Browns often don't get a very good press, but I think this is one that bucks that trend. And on the right, we have the so-called northern wool, which is a species of the Alps and Fennoscandia, rather wrongly named. A male above and the female below, and have I? Yes, I have. The main difference between this and the northern wall is that on the hind wing, it's got this transverse discal line, which is quite clear. And that's pretty much always present. Not quite so clear on the male above, but that's the way to distinguish between that and the large wall, because otherwise they're actually quite similar. Top left, we have White Admiral, mercifully a species we do have in Herts Middx. And in southern France, you have the Southern White Admiral, which is very similar. You can see the similarity of the patterns. You can see how closely they're related. It has this beautiful sort of blue reflective sheen to it with these little bright blue marks along the margin. And it's a butterfly that's very difficult to actually capture how brilliant that colour looks out in the field on the camera. It doesn't quite seem to pick up the colouring. Underneath, you can see the underside, so you can see they're very closely related, but generally they don't fly together. Southern White Admiral is relatively common in Provence, and White Admiral doesn't fly in Provence except in the far north. And on the right, we have the king of this group, the Poplar Admiral, which is actually outdoes the Purple Emperor in terms of size and magnificence. It's a very large and very showy butterfly. The underside is below, and you can see the familiar Admiral pattern on the underside connecting it. But Poplar Admiral is really one of the most iconic species in France. It's a Central European species, very localized and quite rare in eastern central France, but it's a very nervous butterfly. When it comes down to take salts from the ground, you have to approach it very carefully, because otherwise it's off and it gets up into the canopy within a matter of a couple of seconds. Right, we looked at Poplar Admiral, we better look at Purple Emperor now. One of the iconic species of Herts Middx. Purple Emperor, top left, this is a male because you can see the purple colouring, and alongside the underside. And I've compared it with the lesser Purple Emperor. It's one cousin in France. Lesser Purple Emperor is not that much lesser in terms of size. It's slightly smaller, and the colour, as you can see, is slightly bluer, but depending on the angle at which you take the photo, you can get a completely different colour for either of those. The underside is slightly different as well, but the way to tell the difference between the two is that the lesser Purple Emperor has this sort of eye spot on the forewing here, which the Purple Emperor doesn't have. Lesser Purple Emperor is a species, it's relatively common and is really only found near water. I don't think I've ever found it where it hasn't been near water. And it's unusual in the sense that there are two forms. On bottom right, we have the form Clytie, which is either orange or has very limited purple-blue colouring. Not quite sure why Clytie, it's a little bit like Valesina, a certain percentage of the population is of that form, but I'm not sure that anybody really knows why, although there may be people in the audience that know better than I do. But both the nominate form and Clytie do fly together, don't seem to have any problem. Grizzled Skipper, this is, if you see this in Britain, you know it's the Grizzled Skipper, there's no question. Draw breath here, but as we know, it's not quite so simple in France, because that's what you get. You get a selection. Not only do you get Grizzled Skipper, but pretty much south of Lyon, you get the southern Grizzled Skipper, Pigus malvoides, which is very, very similar. I picked two rather extreme examples there so you can see the difference. And then alongside that at the top, you've got the aberration Taurus, where the forewing marks are particularly extended. I borrowed this from the very excellent UK butterfly site. So thanks to Peter, who I think may well be in the audience tonight. this is, it's quite a rare occurrence. I've seen thousands of grizzled skippers in France, but only 3 of the form Tarus, and never one as extreme as this. But it seems to be more common Tarus in Britain, and in some localities it seems to be more numerous than in many other localities. But I won't go through the other 16. If you really want to study Pyrgus, the Pyrgus guide will appear on the EBG website within a couple of weeks or so. Just to illustrate just the extreme variety of some species, these, the top 4 here and bottom left, are marsh Trillary. Marsh Futuri is one of the species that in Britain is pretty much limited to the southern counties in damp areas, but in France there are some 4 or 5 quite distinctly different forms, different in terms of their ecology. Some of them are such as the one second left, or sorry, top left one is the typical UK form. Again, I think I borrowed that from the excellent UK butterfly site, so I'll give that another plug. But second left is Provençalis, which is the form in Provence, this beautiful orange form. And next to that is a female, even more extreme orange form. And on the right, top right, is a high altitude form. I don't actually think it's pure debilis, the pure high altitude form, but high altitude forms, as you go higher in altitude, they tend to get darker and less colourful. And just to complete that, from the wetlands of the Doubs, bottom left, is another marsh Trillary, but they are all the same species. It's just the variation in their sort of physical appearance is just quite dramatic. And I've included, just for completeness, because this is a particularly appealing group, the Euphy group, of which there are 4 in France, the iconic Cynthias Trillary, bottom row, second left. This is a male with the white markings replacing the usual orange markings. Asian Trillary next along, which is beautifully coloured. It's basically very rare and localized in eastern France, another high altitude species. And its lowland cousin, also eastern France, is the scarce Trillary, which you can see the similarity, but they don't fly together. Asian Trillary is usually 2,000 meters plus, and scarce Trillary is very much a lowland species. Top left, clouded yellow, with which we're all familiar. And middle is the female form Helis, which looks very similar to the female of the Burgess clouded yellow. And in fact, when I took this photograph, I actually thought I was photographing a Burgess clouded yellow until something disturbed it, and I got the photo top right. It was more of a reaction rather than anything deliberate. But this clearly showed that it was the form Helis and not Burgess clouded yellow because of the thickness of the black border. Burgess clouded yellow, bottom left, which is actually quite common in Provence. And alongside that, pale clouded yellow. I'm actually not 100% certain that this is pale clouded yellow, because Burgess and pale clouded yellow are very, very similar, generally can't be differentiated on external characteristics. You almost have to see them egg laying to be sure, or breed them. Burgess clouded yellow is very common in Provence. Pale clouded yellow doesn't fly in Provence, and is actually one of the species that, for reasons that we don't understand, is actually becoming much scarcer throughout France and is quite limited. I think it's a subject of some concern. Curiously enough, Burgess clouded yellow wasn't discovered until 1947 as a separate species, because it's a bit similarity to pale clouded yellow. Pale clouded yellow isn't called pale in comparison to Burgess. It was named by the early entomologists, and it's called pale in comparison to the clouded yellow. But nearly all of the photos in books before 1947 labelled as pale clouded yellow are in fact a Burgess clouded yellow. But we'll excuse them that, as they didn't know it was a separate species. And on the bottom right, as many of these species have a high altitude cousin, this is a mountain clouded yellow, sort of quite appealing, sort of yellow coloration, slightly dusky as it's high altitude, but it usually flies at 1,500 meters plus, usually 2,000 plus. Again, just to illustrate that the familiar British species has cousins which are very similar. This is Gatekeeper, top left. This is a male with the underside below. Top middle is.
Only you.
Hello.
Yeah.
Are you muted? Top middle is Southern Gatekeeper. So is there a question as we go through, or? Okay, sorry, I'll continue. Southern Gatekeeper is top middle. This is an Iberian species that again spills into southern France. It can be quite common. The way to tell the difference between that and the Gatekeeper, and these are both males, is that the androconial patch there, the area of the sex band, sex scales, is traversed by the orange veins in Southern Gatekeeper, whereas it's not in the Gatekeeper. And on the right we have, which I think is the prince of the three Gatekeeper species, Spanish Gatekeeper. This is a male, and it's this beautiful orange, again belying the sort of general feeling that browns and Gatekeepers are rather dull butterflies. This is a beautiful orange butterfly. It's Iberian species, which again spills into the far south of France. It almost seems to me that if you take the distribution maps and you were to fill them with black ink as you see them in books, then they've completely filled up Iberia, and they keep on filling them, and it spills into the far south of France, but very much limited to the extreme south. And the underside of the Spanish Gatekeeper is no slouch either. As you can see, bottom right, it's got this beautiful creamy yellow band which just splits the ocelli. I just mentioned a word on the ocelli or eye spots generally. These eye spots here, for people who might not be familiar with the term. I wonder, I just sort of speculate, and this is purely surmising, is whether they have some sort of survival value, because predators always attack at the head end, and in southern France there are plenty of predators that consider butterflies a tasty snack, not only birds, lizards, grasshoppers, crickets, etc. And predators always attack at the head end to disable the prey before quietly munching through the prey without a struggle. And clearly the predators are confused into believing that if these are the eyes, this must be the head end. The predators can't be that clever in believing that if the eyes are that big, then maybe they shouldn't be taking it on. But this might seem like a very fanciful notion, but it's actually surprising how many species with ocelli you see with a V-shaped bite out of the hindwing. And one imagines that a predator's taken a bite and has been very surprised to see its prey fly away. More frituras, because whereas we have a limited number in Britain, there are some 30 or so in France, and for reasons that I don't fully understand, they're just not common. They're not uncommon in France at all. In fact, many frituras are extremely common. Here we've got the two main frituras. They used to be called Guinness, the family name, along with silver wash, but they've now been renamed. High brown as the genus Fabriciana, and dark green as Speyeria. These are males at the top. The high brown, sadly, is a species of considerable concern in Britain. It's limited to a number of sites, mostly in the West. I don't believe flies in company with the dark green fritillary, certainly does in France. But the easy way to tell the difference is that the high brown has these enlarged sex scales on these two veins here, whereas dark green doesn't. There are other ways. For instance, there's a slight concavity in the forewing margin, and its cousin, which occurs in France, mostly in the south of France, is the Niobe Futuri, very, very similar to dark green. I think the only way to tell the difference between the two, and they do fly together, is that these marginal markings here tend to be solid for dark green and tend to be more sagittate for Niobe, but we are into somewhat nerd territory here. This underneath we have the familiar underside of high brown and dark green. They can't be confused from the undersides, and also the underside of Niobe. And there are two forms, the nominate form, and in the south of France, the Eris, which I think just means south, where the underside hindwing is this rather more delicate pattern, sometimes with black edging to the marks, and sometimes as top right here, without this black edging. But the books often quote this little black spot here as being indicative of Niobe, but actually that's completely untrue. Or it may well be true for 60% of Niobe, but there are plenty of Niobe, as this one down here, that just don't have this black spot. So like many of these things quoted in books, it's not definitive. And just by way of illustration, a high altitude, much darker, much more dusky version. This is Niobe female from high altitude, 2090 meters. In fact, I did have a little animation there to show the black spot, if that wasn't clear, as it is rather small. Back to blues, as we are rather hopping around in this meander. Common blue, top left, species that we're all very familiar with. Its direct counterpart, almost direct counterpart, is just to the right of it, Chapman's blue, which is very, very similar. The main differences are that the blue of Chapman's blue has a rather more of a violet tinge. The margin is, the black margin here is slightly thicker than for common blue, and in the androconial area is a sort of slightly darker patch, it's more contrasted. Top right, also of the same Polyamatus genus, is Estrus Blue, a butterfly of southern France, slightly larger than common blue, sometimes with checkering on the hindwing, but a very bright blue. This is a Estrus Blue, bottom left, or high altitude blue. Curiously, the underside is almost identical to that of the common blue, in that they both have an underside cell spot, which generally most of the other Polyamata species don't have, or the old Polyamata species. But Estrus Blue usually flies at 2,000 meters plus and is a much paler, more shimmering silvery blue. And there's quite a few members of this Polyamatus group. I've not included them all. This is turquoise blue. As you can see, it's got a slightly more turquoise tinge, and it's a butterfly of the south of France, often occurs at altitude, but it's quite easy to tell. Apart from the colour, the black of the margin tends to lead in along the veins, extend further along the veins. No comparison would be complete without swallowtails. And top left, we have the British swallowtail. I suspect I might have borrowed this again from UK butterflies. So thanks to UK butterflies and Peter eels. There are two subspecies. The British species, which only flies in the Norfolk Broads, is Britannicus, and it has a slightly duller yellow. And the European counterpart is Gorganus, which has a slightly brighter yellow, but they're both absolutely beautiful butterflies. I did, in discussing this with a group in the south of France, when I was referring to scarce swallowtail, top right, which I'll come to in a moment, referred to it as the ordinary swallowtail, and I did get severely rebuked for referring to it as an ordinary swallowtail because there's absolutely nothing ordinary about it, and I was suitably rebuked. The strange thing is that, again, the difference in the ecology is that in Britain, it's limited to the areas of the Norfolk Broads. It used to be right across Cambridgeshire, Huntingdonshire, but the drainage of the fens for agricultural purposes in the 17 and 1800s drove it eastwards, where it's now limited and protected. But the strange thing is that the Gorganus, the European species, has no such limitation. It flies right across France and flies at 2,000 meters plus, even 2,500 meters plus, and has a habit of hilltopping, flying at across the tops of hills. Top right is the so-called scarce swallowtail, which isn't scarce in France at all, right across France. It was a very rare visitor to Britain in the 17 and 1800s, and the early entomologists were all British, and they're the ones that gave them the names, the English names. But it's a beautiful butterfly, very large, magnificent, beautiful big triangular wings, a very powerful flyer. And bottom right is the rare one in France. It's the Southern Swallowtail, and that is the scarce one. It's very rare and localized in Provence. It's quite common in its stronghold of the Balkans and in Greece, but it's quite very, very rare and very localized in Provence. It's very strange in that it roosts with its wings open. I believe it's the only species to do this. And again, appearances can lie, because although it looks very similar in appearance to the scarce swallowtail, it is actually of the same genus as the swallowtail, the family Papilio. More Fritillaries. Here we have the 4 examples of the Beloria family. There are other examples, but I've just picked these 4 just to illustrate the variation. Top left is the familiar pearl-bordered fritillary, which we're all familiar with. I wouldn't say it's common in France, but it is widespread. You see one most places you go, and it does occur at very high altitudes where it can be quite dark and dusky, like most species lowland species that fly at altitude. Below that is the rather unflatteringly named Bog Futuri, which is really a terrible name, even though it is a fritillary of bogs. And it's a butterfly that is also very disparate in its distribution. It flies in the Morvan, a damp, boggy area in central France, and in the Eastern Pyrenees, and also in Fennoscandia. But very puzzling in that its food plant is bistorte. So why should this be such a scarce butterfly when bistorte is extremely common throughout France at medium altitudes? On the right, we have 2 more, just to show the variation of this particular genus, is the Weaver's fritillary, pretty much unmistakable. It's generally a lowland species, but the forewings are much wider. It has this rather extended appearance where the forewings are much wider than the hind wings. And below that, we have the Titanius fritillary, which is one of the high altitude members of this Beloria family. It can fly at altitude in common with pearl-bordered fritillary, and they can look very similar. But you can always distinguish them if you can see the upper side, because for Titanius fritillary, these marginal marks here, sorry, we're back to the nerd territory again, are very solid extended triangles, whereas for pearl bordered, they're much smaller triangles. We'll look at the undersides of these. Pearl bordered on the left, again, very similar to this small pearl bordered in Britain, the two we have from that family. Below that, we have the underside. This is actually a female underside, slightly more yellow, whereas for pearl bordered, it has these sort of solidish markings. For Bog Futuri, it has these circles. I think this is a beautifully marked. I'm in admiration of some of the delicacy of some of these Trillary markings. The combination of the sort of beige and orange is almost breathtaking, but I'm already convinced. Next to that, we have the Weaver's Trillary underside. Weaver's Trillary has a particularly angled hindwing, as you can see here, which is quite indicative of many of this group. Weaver's Trillary is also called Violet Trillary for reasons of this sort of violet marbling suffusion on the hindwing here. And below that, we have the underside of Titanius Trillary, and this is the nominate form, and it also has a subspecies called Cyprus, which has this sort of purple marbling here, and these much darker markings. But it was always my belief that the nominate form and the subspecies didn't fly together, or they might do, they might overlap, but they usually don't mate. And if they do try to mate, they don't produce any progeny. But this is a photo I've taken with clearly Cyprus at the top and the nominate form below. So presumably they don't form any progeny because there aren't any, I've never seen any intermediate forms. Bit less exciting, but it gets people quite excited nonetheless. This is a small white, male, second brood, top left, and the underside underneath it. Southern small white in the middle, with the much larger apical marking and the straight edge to the discal mark here, creating a bit of excitement at the moment, as I mentioned in the last talk I gave, in that it was a southern European species, but is moving northwards pretty much along the Rhine, and has actually reached the Netherlands. And it's believed that it's not impossible that given time and a bit more climate change or global warming, it might even reach British shores. There have been one or two false alarms already with species that have looked like it might be southern small white, which actually on analysis turned out not to be. I think Jim Asher, who's probably in the audience, probably submitted one of those, not personally, but probably on behalf of somebody. One of the key differences, we're really into nerdy territory here. Oops, sorry, let's go back again. Is that on the underside, the small white has this fork on vein 7, and southern small white doesn't have that fork on vein 7. Apparently, it said that this is not 100% conclusive, but I think it's probably 99% true. On to blues, and this is small blue, male small blue top left, and the underside below that. Its nearest cousin is the Osiris blue of the far south of France. No problem when you see them in flight or with the wings open, because the male Osiris blue is very bright blue, so there's no problem there. The female Osiris blue, top right, I think is actually almost as appealing, and it's black with this beautiful smattering of blue scales in the basal area, and it's a species that's always glued to its larval host plant, samfoin, which you can see the female is on. But the confusion arises from the underside, where they are both very similar, and the often quoted mechanism of telling the difference is that this spot here in this little series of 4 spots is in line for small blue, sorry, not inline for small blue, is basally sort of shifted towards the sort of the head end, towards the body, and is in line for Osiris blue. Well, spots are a bit of a movable feast. They're not always in the same positions, as Bill Raymond and I have found with studying Pyrgus, is that you just can't rely on the spots most of the time. And in fact, with Osiris blue, quite often spot 4 is missing, and on quite a few, spot 3 is missing as well. So you'd almost certainly need to see it in flight to be sure. Next up, the familiar comma. The overwintering brood top left, the first brood produced by the overwintering brood with the special name of Hutchinsoni top middle, and the underside of that below it, and top right, the southern comma, which is a species basically of the Balkans, but does extend across Italy and spills into the far south of France, where it is actually quite rare and localized. It's the markings are generally much lighter on southern comma, but the way to tell the difference, because you can get Hutchinsoni, especially in France, which are much more lightly marked, is that the key is that the forewing margin here is very curved, whereas for southern comma, you can see I've mastered the art of animation, is absolutely straight. So even if they might look similar, that is the differentiating factor. And the southern comma is famed for sitting on stone walls. And although the undersides look very similar, and in fact, whenever you photograph the underside of a southern comma, it inevitably looks out of focus. But the actual comma mark is slightly different. It's rather more of a V shape for southern comma. Just to compare two species which look very similar, we have the ringlet that we're familiar with in southern Britain, again with these ocelli. It's the only member of the Aphantopus family in Europe. So, and there's no mistaking it in Britain. But I include it, not that this is a close relative, false ringlet. And this is something that the early entomologists, so I say we're usually British or usually English, many of them seem to be reverends as far as I can see, who gave the first, the early names, and those names went into books and they've stuck ever since. And they've called a number of species false, whereas it's not false at all. And what they didn't realize, although they could be forgiven for thinking that, is it's actually not a ringlet at all. It's not related to ringlet. It's actually, the false ringlet is a member of the heath family. And I think the heath family is one of the most appealing families in terms of its markings. False ringlet is a butterfly of the wetlands, again, very threatened across Europe, mainly because of the drainage of the wetlands, is now limited to areas in around Bordeaux and in east and central France. And I took this photograph a few years ago when I took my wife on a 4-day tour of the bogs of central France. It was 4 days that included our wedding anniversary, and to be perfectly honest, I think I could have planned it better, but we got the photo. And this is the last slide, just to compare more fritillaries. Sorry, we don't have fritillaries, not very common in Britain, so this is sort of rather rubbing it in. Heath fritillary top left, meadow fritillary top right, which looks very, very similar, and they often do fly together. The much rarer Nichols fritillary bottom left, and another false species, false heath fritillary bottom right. I can't quite understand why heath fritillary is so localized and threatened in Britain, because it's phenomenally common in France. You see it almost everywhere, right across France, at lowland and pretty much at altitude, although it's not a high altitude specialist. Meadow fritillary is something of a misnomer because they all fly in meadows. It's not restricted to the meadow fritillary. Meadow fritillary also flies at very high altitude, 2,000 meters plus. So it's got a range from sea level to 2,000 meters plus. But the one key way of telling the difference between these two, I find, not usually mentioned in books, is that the shading around these marginal lunules, little moon-shaped marks in spaces 1 and 2, I won't bore you with the details of how we name those, is very heavily shaded in black around those areas, whereas for meadow fritillary, it's not. It's much more lightly shaded, and that seems to be a constant. I mean, people say that the way to tell the difference is that there's no discal line for heath fritillary. Sorry, there is a discal line for heath fritillary, and there isn't for meadow fritillary, but these markings can vary enormously. This is a heath fritillary with no discal line, and this meadow fritillary has semblance of a discal line. But another way of telling the difference between the two is that this mark here in the space 1 of the forewing is oblique, is angled at about 45 degrees. Not entirely clear from this photographic angle. The heath fritillary marking can look similar, but is never as clearly angled as for the meadow fritillary. But Nichols fritillary is an Eastern European species which confined to a few localities in east and central France, but is quite rare there. And false heath fritillary is the upland member of this particular group. And it varies enormously in terms of its colouring. And this one, as you can just about see in the hindwings, are almost completely black. And it is quite strange to see a butterfly that is almost completely black in flight, because that the darkness is quite apparent. But again, it's a species that flies 1,500 meters or above, or generally above 2,000 meters. But anyway, that was the last slide. So I hope you've enjoyed this meander. I'll happily try and take any questions, but if there's anybody in the audience who knows the answer better than I do, I'm happy to defer to them. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Roger. That was fantastic talk. Thanks ever so much. And apologies to everyone that for the poor broadband connection at the start. I'm sorry that I didn't manage to introduce you properly as I'd intended. But we have had a few questions that have come in the chat room. Corinne was asking about maps. Whereabouts was the best place to find some good distribution maps, I guess, showing where different butterflies are located in France?
Well, there's a variety of different books. There are some general books. Probably the best, I'm just trying to think how best to reach it. There's not only books, but there's also a website by Tristan Lafranchi, and I think he sort of publishes under the name of Diatheo, D-I-A-T-H-E-O, which if you Google that, it might come up with Lafranchi's website. Lafranchi is L-A-F-R-A-N-C-H-I-S, and he has some very good distribution maps. It's in French, but they're quite easy to find. You will need to know the scientific names. So that's the most detailed maps. In terms of books, Pan-European, he did a book that said identifying butterflies is easy, but probably the classic is the Collins Guide to Butterflies of Britain and Europe by Tom Tolman, and with illustrations by Richard Lewington, and that does give pan-European maps. Am
I allowed to interrupt there, Roger? I can make a good suggestion here.
Yeah.
If people go on to a site called Lepidiv, they will find all maps for all butterflies right up to date. It's very good. It's free.
How are you spelling that?
Capital L-E-P-I, capital D-I-V. It's a German site, Lepidiv, for butterflies across Europe. It has all the up-to-date, and we use them in our identification guides. It's a free resource.
Thank you very much.
It also, just add that it depends where you're going. If you're going anywhere in France, there are a lot of very good atlases produced by regions or departments in France. If you're going to Provence or the PACA region, Provence, Alps, Côte d'Azur, which is the sort of bottom right-hand corner of France, they've just published an excellent guide. It's about €35. It's a superb work, but it gives you detailed distribution maps of every species that flies in the area. So there's different levels of detail that depending on where you want to go.
What's that called again?
It's the guide to, it's published by CEN, Conservatoire d'Espace Naturel, CEN-PACA, P-A-C-A. I've got a feeling if you go onto my website, I've still got something on the front about that being published. I think there's a direct link to it.
That's the Butterflies of France website, Roger.
Butterfliesfrance.com, sorry.
Yeah, okay. I think Dick had a question too about what swallowtail larvae feed on, which I think Jim had said perhaps wild carrot and umbellifers, but is that your understanding as well?
Fennel in France, they feed on fennel, and it grows pretty much everywhere.
Thank you.
And they don't try and hide because they have pretty much immunity against predators from the colouring. But you can't fail to see the swallowtail caterpillars on fennel, quite unmistakable.
There's much lively speculation as to whether Wall Brown might expand into Hertfordshire or Upper Thames branch area again, which I'm sure it will one day. But I was going to ask if Wall is suffering equally badly on the continent as it is here, because it does seem to have been the spectacular flop amongst our butterflies over the last sort of generation. Is it sort of leaving huge white holes in France as well as over here?
What do you mean, the wall?
Yes.
I think it's not uncommon in southern France, but I think there's probably concern as you go further north. All species are under a degree of threat. Don't get me on to the impact of vineyards and the ever-expanding vineyards in France eating up natural terrain, but that's a sort of major threat in the far south of France. But it's a fairly common species. You tend to see it, I would say wherever you go, but most places.
Pete Hills has followed a few dozen different swallowtail caterpillar food plants in the chat for anyone that wants to plant a suitable meadow to attract them to their garden.
Well, one of the things
that eats anything.
Sorry, one of the things I'll just add is that food plants, whereas we come to understand the food plants of particular species being quite specific in Britain, they don't seem to be quite as fussy in France. They tend to have a much wider range of possible food plants.
Aidan and Emma have posted a comment that says the wall has declined in Flanders, Belgium, just as much as it has in the UK. That Dirk Mize has published about it. I think I have heard it's declined quite a lot in Holland as well, so which supports what you said about it doing poorly in the northern parts. I think we've pretty much exhausted all the questions, unless anyone else has got a burning question. Feel free to unmute and ask if you have.
I was going to make an observation, if that's okay. Bill Lehman here.
Sure, Bill.
It
Go
was
ahead.
just, Roger was talking about the fork on vein 7 on small white and southern small white.
Yes.
when I was working on the Pyrrhus guide, I put that in just as you had, but the majority of experts told me that they didn't think it was consistent. So I took it out of that guide.
It's not absolute, but it's like so many things. It's if it's got the fork, you're probably 95% certain that it's small white. There are exceptions, has been well known, Bill, because it's taken a phenomenal amount of work to get examples of all the Pyrgus species that exactly match the narrative.
Absolutely.
So we didn't have to put in a picture and say, well, we're telling you this in the words, but the picture we're putting in doesn't actually match it. There are natural variants, and people do say that it isn't definitive, but it is a pretty good indication.
Yeah. Can I make another observation? Am I allowed to?
One more.
One more. I was going to say the photograph of the Southern White Admiral was absolutely brilliant. The best photograph I've ever seen of a Southern White Admiral. The colouring is.
It's
But
better if you see it in the field.
Well, I have, but I've never seen it. I've never managed to catch it in that light that you have. It's brilliant.
High praise indeed. Well, that's a good.
Yeah, there's just one more question in the chat, Malcolm. Perhaps it's Dominic Kanafi says, I'm often in Villefranche-sur-Mer by Nice. Do you have any suggestions on where to find interesting butterfly spots?
Sorry, Sanary-sur-Mer, did she say?
Villefranche. Villefranche-sur-Mer?
Yeah.
Yes.
This is
Hello.
This is.
Do you hear?
Sorry, is that Dominique speaking now?
This is Dominique speaking. Yes. Hello. Yeah. Yes. Villefranche-sur-Mer. Yes.
Well, you're in absolutely the right part of the world.
Oh, great.
Alps Maritime is one of the richest departments in France. I spent 6 months of the summer, which I feel suitably guilty, in the Var, which is almost as good. But if you travel north, once you escape the environs of
Nice,
then once you've got up to towns like Bio, north of Sophia Antipolis, there's lots of good terrain. One area I would suggest is that if you go north into the Mercantour, there's a little village called Rimplas, Rimplas, and behind the little hostelry hotel, that's about an hour from Nice, there is a track which leads down a mountainside, a zigzag track, which a lot of people now know about, because I included it on the tour of the Mercantour. I've personally seen over the years 108 species there, and you'll see 40 species in a couple of hours.
Wow, it's a Rimplas is the name of the village?
Rimplas, Rimplas, sorry, English spelling.
L-A-S. Rimplas, okay. Times selves, do you guys tours in France or something? Or no?
So we can't hear you very well.
Excuse me, internet is very bad.
Yeah.
So,
Maybe put something in the
asking,
chat, and we'll see if we can get Roger to answer it in the chat.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Well, look, thanks ever so much, everyone, for dialing in. As I meant to say at the start, very, very warm welcome to all our friends from European Butterflies Group. And delighted you could join us for this talk. And it's really good to. I think we've had a record attendance for our winter talks tonight. We've got nearly 70 people, which is fantastic. So you're very welcome, and thanks for joining us. Just for the Herts Middlesex members, we will be sending out our next newsletter early in May, which will have a lot more information about our exciting Big City Butterflies project in London. which we talked about quite a lot at the Members' Day last weekend. And we'll also be sending out our events programme. We're really hoping that we can get back out in the fields with our butterfly walks and moth traps from later on in May. We've got a great programme of events lined up. And of course, anyone from European Butterflies Group wants to join us is very welcome as well. But we are all, they're all, if you don't get our newsletter direct, they're all publicised on the Butterfly Conservation's national events website. So they'll be loaded up there probably about the time the newsletter goes out, sort of early in May. So you'll, even if you're not a member of the branch, you'll be able to pick up what we're up to, and very welcome to join us. Most of the walks are free, although a few where we have partner organisations that do run booking systems, there's sometimes a small charge, but everyone's welcome, and we're just keeping fingers crossed that lockdown rules will allow us to get out and about. I'm sure Roger is also keeping his fingers crossed that he might get back to France at some stage this year, but I don't know if things are looking very good for that right now, Roger. What's the prospects, do you think?
Well, I mean, normally we would leave first week in April, but that isn't going to happen. My friend in France, Tim Cowles, I don't know if you know Tim at all, lives in Lyon, so they've just gone into lockdown for the month of April, and if things don't improve, that will be extended to May. So it's not looking good.
No. My daughter's in Belgium.
Yeah.
They've been in a lockdown for the last 5 months, but it's suddenly ramped up quite a lot this last weekend, and there's a big spike in the virus there. So it's not looking good, I think, for our continental holidays this year. But thank you ever so much, Roger, for your time. And I can't imagine how many hours it's taken to not only to do all the photographs, but then to put it all together in such a knowledgeable way, make it so accessible to people. I think it's great credit to you, and also I think to your optician with all the being able to spot all those different little spots on the wings. I must ask you for a recommendation, because I must say I do struggle with them sometimes. But
You have to join the Serious Nerd Club first.
Great. Okay. Well, look, thank you everybody for dialing in. It's been a great evening. I really appreciate it, and we are hoping to run some more winter talks next winter. But this is the last one in our current series. But if you do want to watch this talk again, or just to refresh your memory on any of those difficult diagnoses, or indeed to watch any of our other winter talks, there are recordings being made of all of them, apart from the one I gave, which I didn't manage to record. But all the other ones have been expertly recorded, and they're all accessible via the homepage of the Herts Middx Butterfly Conservation website. There's links there that will take you through to each of the individual talks, and there's some fascinating information on all of them. I'd really worth spending a bit of time on if you've got a few quiet hours in the evening. So thanks everyone for coming. Thanks ever so much to Roger for giving the talk, and for now, cheerio.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.